This month might have some absolutely crazy cards because we finally got the official reveals for the upcoming February season of cards, and some of them got buffed since their data mined versions when I already thought they were pretty darn good. So a few of these I think have crazy meta disruption potential, and I don't think there's a single bad card in this entire batch. So we're going to talk about all of these in great detail. Then I'm going to give each of them a rating from 1 to 4 stars. But let's kick things off here with the season pass card for the month. It's Black Swan, and she is a 3/5 that reads, on reveal until the end of your next turn, your 1-cost cards cost 0. So before this was a 2/3 in the data mining, but now a 3/5, which is actually a premium stat line. You know, we see Cyclops setting the vanilla stat line at 3/4 for 3 drops, and she is bigger than that, which traditionally when that happens, that means the card has some kind of like potential downside or risk. You know, we see Spider-Man as a 3/5 because, like, well, maybe you don't want him moving into the wrong spot. Maybe you don't want to move your opponent's cards. So sometimes good, sometimes bad means they give you a little extra stats. For cards that are like all upside, we usually see those come in as like 3/3s, and there's so many 3/3s in Marvel Snap that showcase that example. But Black Swan is exclusively upside. This effect is just all good. This is in fact a really powerful effect, I think, because we're going to talk about more, that could be like deck defining, but yet she still gets to be a 3/5. So she gets this really nice base stat line with this really positive effect. And that feels different than the model we've seen for these sorts of cards in the past. So number one, really big base stat line. Like, this is going to feel good sometimes to just slam on turn 3. You know, you don't necessarily need to reap crazy benefits out of this. You get a good stat line on turn 3. Maybe you just weave in an extra couple 1-drops on turn 4, and you've netted some discount value on this, but you've also got a really strong 3-drop alongside it. That might feel worth it in many scenarios. So just like a tempo line in a deck that's running some 1-drops, probably not bad. But then of course we have the like huge upside on Black Swan and the kind of combo potential or deck build around potential, where you perhaps play Black Swan on turn 5 and then look for some sort of blow up on turn 6. I think the most obvious example for me is something like Hit Monkey, who's looking to play a bunch of cards in a single turn. Well, now you can play a bunch of 1-cost cards for 0, weave all of those together with your Hit Monkey, and just go crazy on that final turn. We see that a little bit today with cards like Beast, setting 1-cost cards down to 0. That is a little bit harder to work with sometimes. Black Swan, you just slam it and it works, and you can just keep all those cards at hand and know that it's going to get there. Whereas Beast, you know, you have to line it up a little bit more, you know, perhaps susceptible to disruption. Can be an upside to play them multiple times, of course, but Black Swan offers something a little bit unique and different. On top of that, we've got stuff like a Thanos deck. You know, suddenly you can play Thanos and some stones together on the final turn. So right now, getting to like a 20 power Thanos, although not common, you kind of show your hand early because that Thanos costs the full 6 on 6. You can play Black Swan on 5, play Thanos and 3 or 4 stones all together on the final turn to really catch people off guard. Slamming a Soul Stone and a Power Stone could be an enormous power swing on their own, but then also Thanos getting really big potentially as well. And then we've got stuff like Zoo decks as well. Play this on 5 and play a bunch of Zoo cards alongside a Blue Marvel all at once on the final turn. Could be, again, a bunch of surprise power. So you've got various ways, and I probably haven't even thought of them all, to utilize Black Swan as this big combo setup piece where she's really offering a lot of unpredictability. Like, even if your opponent knows you're going to do something big on turn 6, they don't know how many 1-drops you have, how big it's going to be. So that can give you a really nice advantage if they're playing with more predictable numbers. But I wouldn't sleep on this card with any deck that's running just 1-cost stuff, that's happy to just kind of play this and get a couple free cards the next turn. And it's like suddenly this feels like kind of a 1/5 or a 0/5 because she netted you a few energy of discounts along the way. That's going to be a pretty solid play. I was thinking about like Silver Surfer. You know, sometimes that deck wants to run like a Nova or a Forge, 1-drops that can help spread stats because, you know, Forge into Brood or Nova into Killmonger, both lines we've seen in Sarah Surfer decks in particular. Well, suddenly with Black Swan, maybe a little easier to weave those in on turn 6. You can play a Forge into a Brood, into a Surfer on turn 6, which otherwise that Brood could sometimes get left out if you don't draw it early enough or on time. So even just little stuff like that, and Black Swan, of course, a great fit in a Silver Surfer deck. So I don't know, man. This card with that base stat line being so big, seems like the sky is the limit on this one. Good in tempo plays and tempo decks, good for combo setups. I just see a lot of potential for this one. So moving on here, we have Supergiant. She is a 4/5 on reveal. All cards played next turn don't reveal until the game ends. And man, when this was initially data mined, I think it was like a 1/2 or something. It looked completely insane. It was so cheap and flexible. It has been dialed back a ton to a 4/5, but I still think this card has some interesting potential. And there are basically offensive and defensive ways I think you might want to be able to use this one. So what was showcased in the reveal video are some of the defensive options, where if you're thinking your opponent is going to try to play some big, awesome turn 5 linchpin card, a MODOK, an Annihilus, a Sarah, they even talked about a Leech in that video. Well, you can play Supergiant on turn 4, and then their turn 5 card is not going to reveal by the time it needs. Like that MODOK needs to be revealed on turn 5 to set up for like the big Apocalypse and Swarm and empty the hand for Dracula and so on. So it revealing on turn 6 could sometimes mess things up and put things out of sequence. And Sarah, of course, needs to be available on turn 5 to discount that turn 6. If Sarah is hidden, suddenly everything costs a lot more on turn 6. So clearly a real disruptive and obstructive sort of card to some decks' game plans. A lot of decks have that very specific turn 5 that they're trying to achieve, and this could absolutely put a wrinkle in those plans. And you're maybe not sacrificing too much of a stat, upside here as a 4/5 to do that. Now, of course, there'll be plenty of other matchups where you play this on turn 4 and the opponent just doesn't care because we're going to play some big stats anyway on turn 5, and they just continue and proceed with their game plan, and this had zero disruptive value at all. But there will be those key moments like, okay, this is a discard deck. They're going to want a MODOK. Clearly, this is going to be an awesome disruptive sort of play. When you talk about the card in that space, though, it's always just a question of like, how often will that be worth it? Like, is it disruptive enough? Can I snap into a way where this gives me a cube upside? Can the opponent kind of just play around it anyway? Can they change their line and still make a good play? Like, okay, they're a Sarah deck that's normally going to play Sarah, but they see Supergiant come down on turn 4. Maybe they can still weave together a couple good plays out of that and pivot and maybe not really feel all that much downside from the Supergiant. So as a disruptive tool, I don't know if decks are going to want to run it specifically for that. I suspect there will be decks that run Supergiant for other reasons, which we're going to talk about shortly, that occasionally do also benefit from that sort of disruption aspect. So now to shift over and talk about this card offensively, there are a couple different angles you could take, and the first one I'm going to try is probably a Hela deck. Now, this does need a little bit of help from an energy standpoint to work well with Hela. Basically, you either need an increase to max energy or maybe a magic so that you can basically play Supergiant on turn 4 and then Hela on turn 5, hiding the Hela until the end of the game, and then follow it up with a MODOK after the fact, which will reveal immediately because it won't be in the next turn. It'll be the turn after Supergiant's effects, and then it's just kind of banking that Hela until the end of the game. So that could be like a turn 5, 6, 7 line if you have magic in play, or if you've ramped some max energy, you could play Hela on turn 5, of course, and then MODOK on turn 6. So there's some possibilities there using this as an alternative to Invisible Woman, basically that same sort of combo. Unlike the Invisible Woman, you can't put both the cards in the non-revealed line, but it's also maybe a little bit less susceptible to disruption than Invisible Woman. You know, there's Enchantresses and Cosmos and such. Sometimes you're showing your hand a little too hard with that Invisible Woman. So there might be some interesting lines there potentially with Supergiant. It's just going to require a little bit of a deck structure and energy manipulation. And then the other offensive use case for this card I wanted to talk about is comboing it with Alioth, because basically Supergiant allows you to lock in whatever the turn 4 priority is. So for instance, if you build a deck with a bunch of like high statted early cost cards, you go into turn 4, you play Supergiant, and you end up ahead on priority, you're going to stay ahead on priority guaranteed into turn 6. Nothing is revealing on turn 5, which means no stats are added to the board, which means priority is going to stay the same as it was on turn 4, which means your Alioth going into turn 6 is for sure going to connect. And not only that, but it's going to have an extra turn of bodies to potentially destroy, because all those cards that were played on turn 5 are still going to be unrevealed, which means you can choose and pick your Goliath a little bit, hitting, you know, a guaranteed play that you saw on turn 5, or maybe catching multiple cards that got played across turn 5 and turn 6. So we could see some like super early priority manipulation decks that slam a Supergiant and then play into that big Goliath on turn 6. And that's another nice little 2-card combo, basically, that probably doesn't require much else support or help, which makes Supergiant this interesting offensive threat as well. So you've got that defensive potential, disruption potential. You've got a couple different ways to use this offensively, and I'm sure more of those will crop up as well, because I'm sure there's going to be scenarios where hiding your turn 5 play for whatever reason feels like a really smart and powerful thing to do. So I don't know, this card, it's very kind of conditional. It's one of those that requires really specific support, which can sometimes hold cards back, but other times it only takes one really powerful deck to make these feel super good and super frustrating to play against. So I'm holding out a little bit of hope for Supergiant. Just keep in mind, it's one of those cards you might have to put in your back pocket for a while. It might take a minute or two for a deck to really show up and use this well. So moving on here, we've got Cull Obsidian, and this big old 4/10. You can only play this where you have a 1-cost card. So this got changed quite a bit from the initial data mined version, which requires you to have an Infinity Stone, which, if you remember, I actually complained that made this the first ever parasitic card in Marvel Snap that required you to have access to another specific card in Thanos. Thankfully, they've reverted that, though, here and made this more general use. I think this was even my suggestion, making it work with all 1-cost cards. So this is in that sort of Crossbones space. A slightly overstated 4-drop is Crossbones that requires you to be ahead to play him. Well, you don't even have to be ahead with Cull Obsidian. You just have to have a 1-cost card in play, which I think is actually a notably easier condition to meet than Crossbones. And Cull Obsidian is notably larger than Crossbones as a 4/10. Now, that 10 power threshold is important, of course, because that does make this susceptible to Shang-Chi, which, you know, I hate to say a card's weaker because it's easily countered. That's not usually a great argument in card games. It's a better argument these days because Shang-Chi is absolutely everywhere and does make this a risk, even if you're able to spread threats across the board wide. This is just an instant target for Shang-Chi, and the original version of this card did say it can't be destroyed. This version does not. So this card might actually be notably better if it were a 4/9 instead of a 4/10, but a 4/10 is important for another reason, which is Scar. And Scar is a card that's actually getting played a little bit, and having these really reliable, cheap ways to discount your Scar is nice. And in particular, you know, in a Zabu deck with Cull Obsidian, you can play Zabu on 2, Cull Obsidian on 3. We've got access to a couple other 4-drops that get up to 10 power. Could easily see your Scar going to 0 on turn 6. Even a cheap like 2-cost Scar on turn 6 is nice when you have big 4-drops like this one as well. So another kind of weapon in the 10-drop pool. This is great for Thanos decks potentially as well, giving you a power spike. I could even see this being a tall power spike in Zoo decks. Sometimes those go really wide, but I've had a hard time getting tall with big singular threats. This is a possibility there. Shang-Chi might always keep these sorts of things in check, so maybe we need a Shang-Chi nerf or power change for Cull Obsidian to feel a little bit safer, but I still think, you know, cheap, flexible, high-powered threats like this show up. You know, we have these popping into decks all the time, including Crossbones himself actually pops up from time to time. So, yeah, Thanos decks, I mean, a lot of decks just run, you know, Nebulas and Sunspots, and it's not hard at all to meet this condition, I don't think. It does sometimes mean you're going to have to double down a little bit on power, but not really. There's so many decks that can flex small 1-drops in. Supporting them a little is not going to hurt. So, yeah, I don't think a card that's going to, like, blow your socks off ever. It's not going to be a build around or anything, but a nice, flexible, high-powered tool I'm sure will show up here and there. Moving on to Corvus Glaive. This is a 3/5. I think we'd seen this maybe a 3/4. The initial data mine, I can't remember exactly, but he's an on reveal. Discard 2 cards from your hand to get +1 max energy. And that +1 max energy, that's the same effect as Electro, ramping you up, so you're getting that benefit every single turn. So you play this on 3, on turn 4, you go to 5 energy. Turn 5, you go to 6. Turn 6, you go to 7. And of course, that's particularly nice so that you can play multiple 6-drops in a row. That's what we see with Electro Ramp playing like the Doctor Doom into the Odin. And that can be really powerful. That's usually the line you're most excited about. You can also heavily stack these decks with extra 5-drops, since you're going to be skipping turn 4 very often and going straight to 5 energy, which can be nice to cheat out those big 5s. Now, Corvus Glaive is interesting, though, because instead of Electro limiting it to 1 card per turn, this is going to discard stuff instead. So you actually have more flexibility to play multiple cards, which could be nice. You know, suddenly on turns, you know, you got 7 energy, you can play a 4 and a 3 together. Maybe that opens up something different than a singular, like, 6-drop being played. So there could be some different shapes of ramp decks, perhaps. But the risk, I think, is that discarding 2 cards means you're not going to have a lot of stuff to play. So in a lot of ways, it actually feels a little bit like Electro, because you're going to have to sort of pick and choose anyway. When you have fewer resources in hand, it's going to be harder to weave multiple ones together. I will also say the decks that often benefit the most from energy manipulation and bonus energy tend to be things that are a little bit more combo oriented. They're looking to achieve specific plays, like, oh, I really need to play, you know, an Arnim Zola a turn early, or I want to cheat a Null into play on turn 5 so that I can Arnim Zola it on turn 6, right? Really specific sequences and lines and combos, which discard is a much bigger risk against than something like Electro. Electro is not really all that risky if you're only planning 1 card per turn anyway. Suddenly the discard becomes really risky in those scenarios. You can't risk discarding your Null or your Arnim Zola if that is your combo. So in a way, this could be a great combo enabler, but in another way, actually really risky and disruptive. So instead, do we see this in just discard decks, right? Is this just an awesome discard tool where we have a Hell Cow that also gives us a little bit of extra energy? I think absolutely that's possible. I would say discard is a deck traditionally that hasn't benefited a ton from energy ramp. They have a pretty fixed curve, but maybe this creates opportunities to run a little bit greedier things and bigger stuff to weave in there in that discard deck. So you have, more time to play bigger things. On turn 4, you can play a 3 and a 2 together, whereas before that wouldn't have been possible, and still play your MODOK on that next turn and so on. Weave a Meek in there suddenly because you got that extra energy. So this could help fuel that kind of just bigger, greedier discard package as well. So ultimately, good base stat line. The max energy, obviously, we've seen Electro work a ton over the years. This is just a different look at that. Some ways might be better, other ways might be riskier. But yeah, this is an interesting card. I'm sure there will be reasons to run this. Max energy is good, and the cost, the risk here, notable, but not impossible to overcome by any means. Now, speaking of discard here, we've got Proxima Midnight. She is now a 4/7. She was initially, I think, a 4/6, and she's kind of nuts, I think. When this is discarded, jumps to your lowest power location that isn't full. So, this is just a free 7 power body in discard decks, and that's nuts, man. You play MODOK on turn 5 with Proxima Midnight in hand, you're just getting 7 power for free. And you might say, oh, it's kind of a weakness that it's going to your lowest power location. Maybe that's the spot you're least likely to contest. But 7 is big enough that it's probably going to take your lowest power location and make it somewhere that you are contesting, and make it somewhere that your opponent really has to suddenly figure out how to beat. Like, that's a really big, meaty power addition at 7, and it really spreads you wide. And if you've got stuff like Swarms in hand in particular, those give you so much power flexibility across multiple locations. You're likely going to be able to contest really well to support that Proxima Midnight that just landed. So to me, this is just absolutely really, really good. And if you have to play this as a 4/7, guess what? You're getting a premium stat line. Again, that's above vanilla for a card that's just otherwise all upside on this effect. So I don't think you're going to feel too sad playing a 4/7 sometimes if you don't have the MODOK in hand, or you don't think you're going to be able to discard this safely. Just play it. And then, of course, other instances, save it for the MODOK or try to hit it with a Hell Cow, whatever it is. You're just going to randomly land into this sometimes, and you're going to feel very excited that you got a 0/7 that you didn't have to play. That's just an enormous bonus for discard decks. I feel like this gives discard decks a really nice edge. They're one of those lists that's always kind of teetering on like the edge of viability. They're usually like okay and solid, but never like top tier. This could push discard top tier as far as I'm concerned. This is so much efficiency, so much extra power for free. It just adds a lot of fuel to that discard package. So Between these two cards in particular, discard has some great new tools to play with potentially. I don't know if Corvus Glaive actually makes as much sense in discard. I'm sure there will be lists that use him, but Proxima Midnight, if you're running a traditional discard deck, I just don't see why you're not running this card. Like, you just have to run this card. It fits too darn well, and it's just too free. So looks really strong to me. So that said, let's rate these cards from 1 to 4 stars. Black Swan is a 4-star card. Proxima Midnight is a 4-star card. Cull Obsidian is a 3-star card. Corvus Glaive is a 3-star card. Supergiant is a 3-star card. And there you go. Yeah, I think all 5 of these look very playable. I think Proxima Midnight and Black Swan both look very strong. Those premium stat lines with big effects is a recipe for success as far as I'm concerned. So I think this could be a pretty big month. A lot of potential here. So curious to hear your thoughts on these cards. Any cool lines, any cool combos, any cool deck ideas you want to share in the comments below that I missed or you want to talk about more. Happy and excited to read those. Thanks so much as always for watching, and until next time, game on.